Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup. You're with Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch. That's Zoe. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. I almost said I'm Prashad. I was meaning to say we're missing Prashad once again. It's 170 second show, moving up slowly to the 200th show. But there we go. We're plugging along. Want to start today's show with an important report that has come out from the International Organization of Migration. The IOM basically calculates on a global scale the movement of people around the world. And what the recent IOM report has shown is that worldwide, 281 million people are on the move. That's about just under 4% of the global population. Now, why this is important, 281 million people on the move is in 1990, just before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Around that time, there were 153 million people on the move. In 1970, 84 million people. Now, the question is, why has there been such an enormous increase, not only in the absolute numbers of people on the move? Of course, the world population has increased, but also the relative numbers. We're almost up to 4% of the world's population. If you look at in a country, foreign-born migrant, those numbers, in fact, now something like the fifth largest country in the world is made up of foreign-born migrants into a country. That's enormous, a very large population. Well, the fact is that the International Organization of Migration's Director General Amy Pope puts the point squarely in her press conference at the release of the report. She said more people are fleeing war or fleeing violence. That's the underlying point. More people are fleeing economic hardship or lack of opportunity. More people are fleeing the impacts of climate change or food scarcity. And increasingly, people are fleeing a combination of all of the above. I think the last point is really the one that's most important. People are fleeing all of the above. Catastrophic floods in Brazil, likely in the Rio Grande do Sul region, likely people are not going to be able to go back home. They are going to become internally displaced people. The largest population of people on the move are internally displaced. In fact, Europe considers itself to be one of the places where migrants come. It's not true. The bulk of migrants seem to travel within countries and within continents, within Africa or within Asia. That's where the bulk of migration takes place. People are not watching the boats crossing the Indian Ocean, or they're not watching the boats crossing the Arabian Sea. The boats that go from the Horn of Africa to Yemen and Saudi Arabia, even now, even in the midst of the tensions and so on, that is not being looked at in the same way as the boats crossing the Mediterranean, for obvious historical colonial reasons. But the IOM points to something very important, that it's not just that migrants move and create problems or whatever. The migrant as the problem is the discourse that's out there. What the IOM has shown, in fact, is that if you look at remittances, the money that these migrants sent home increased by 650% from 2000 to 2022, from 128 billion to 831 billion. This is incredible. This is much higher than foreign direct investment into these countries. So, for instance, the international financial sector puts less into low-income, middle-income countries than their own migrants do. In the case of Nepal, for instance, Nepali remittances are higher from working-class Nepalis who are out there working in hotels or cleaning offices and so on. Their remittance payments in total are higher than the foreign direct investment into that country. Similarly, you look at a country like Mexico, vast amounts of foreign direct investment come into Mexico. That's true. But the remittance payments are incredible. When you add that up, it's going to have an impact, certainly, Zoe, on the Mexican elections. Maybe we should go right to the Mexican election because, there are Mexicans in Mexico that are going to vote, but there's a very large number of Mexicans in countries like the United States and so on, those who have been financing the Mexican treasury. Let's just talk about the Mexican election for a minute because I know it's really, really quite contentious.
Yes, that's exactly right. On June 2nd, the people of Mexico will go to the polls to elect the next president of the country. It is a very interesting election. We actually interviewed one of the front-runner candidates, Claudia Sheinbaum, last year in Mexico City while she was still head of government of Mexico City. She is facing off her main front-runners, Xochitl Galvez, who is the joint candidate for PRI and PAN. And if you know Mexican politics, you know that PRI and PAN essentially held power for decades and decades, and a very similar right-wing policy of both those parties, and they have essentially come together in what is a natural unity of bourgeois parties in the country to face off against Morena. Morena is the party of Andrés López Obrador, who's currently president of Mexico. Morena has formed a coalition with other parties, with the Workers' Party of Mexico, with the Green Party. This is the coalition that is currently leading the government, that is currently implementing this Mexican humanism, the anti-neoliberal policies of AMLO's government. And Claudia Sheinbaum, her main campaign slogan has been, let's continue making history. And so it's a real continuity of these policies. Xochitl, on the other hand, PRI-PAN coalition, interestingly enough, in some of the debates in a lot of her campaigning, she realizes how popular actually the policies of AMLO are. And so while saying that Claudia Sheinbaum and Morena is the most corrupt party, that they're responsible for, this and that acts of corruption, she also has said that she wants to continue policies such as the increase in minimum wage, the guaranteeing of certain social rights and economic rights that have been granted under AMLO. So it's interesting because we have seen the right having to capitulate to these social and economic programs and demands of the people, because under this government of Morena, there has been a significant increase in people's social and economic well-being, and that's why AMLO has held an extremely high approval rating, over 60% throughout most of his presidency, which is quite impressive in terms of approval ratings at this moment in history for world leaders. But of course, these are very, very contentious elections. The Mexican electoral machinery, extremely large. This is a huge country, diverse country with diverse populations, with many different races going on. We also know that there are local elections in the city of Mexico. Clara Brujada, who is also running from Morena, is trying to win the head of government of Mexico City. She was mayor of Iztapalapa, which is one of the poorest districts in Mexico City, where she ran different programs promoting women's advancement and gender equality. Extremely interesting programs. If you hadn't heard about them, the utopias, integrating gender equality into social policies. So this is all at stake on the June 2nd elections. Again, there have been many accusations of dirty campaigns taking place. Different sorts of accusations of bribery, of all sorts of things. And on June 2nd, again, the Mexican people are going to go to the polls and say, do they want to continue making history, as the Morena coalition says? Do they want to go with Xochitl Galvez? Either way, Mexico is going to have its first woman president, whether it's Xochitl, whether it's Claudia. It's going to be a very historic day for the Mexican people, and we'll definitely be following this at People's Dispatch.
Well, Mexico can say to the United States, just north of the border, we have a female president before you, because there's no chance that there'll be a female president this time in the United States, even though there are some women running for president, I know that there's a woman running in on a left standard, but I don't think she's going to prevail. Mexico once again ahead of the United States. That's pretty impressive. It's got to be said, I think, that the reason the right sometimes drifts now into policies of social welfare is that austerity has basically hit the end of the bone. I mean, there's nowhere else to go in many countries. Nowhere else to go in many countries, certainly not in Gaza, where in Rafah now news comes that all bakeries have shut down. It is very hard to get food in the areas along the coastline of Gaza, the southern coastline towards the Egyptian border, where people have fled. 800,000 people have fled from Rafah. In that area, people are burning trash in order to have fire to cook food. There is simply no fuel in that area. The shortages are insanely high. I mean, there's the lack of something like fuel means that people are burning trash, means that they are breathing in all kinds of terrible effluents and so on. God knows what's happening. There is no safe water to drink. There has not been much rain or anything, so people cannot harvest water. They are really struggling to survive. Almost 1 million people pushed out of Rafah, where Rafah itself, as I said, bakeries shut down and so on. Meanwhile, two important developments regarding the Israeli genocidal campaign in Gaza. One is that the special rapporteur on torture, Alice Jill Edwards, made a statement this week saying that there's enough evidence of torture. She said that deprivation of liberty has been taking place, certainly, but people are not being treated humanely, whatever the circumstances of their detention. That last point is very important. She said she has seen allegations of individuals being beaten, kept in cells, blindfolded, handcuffed for excessive periods, deprived of sleep, and threatened with physical and sexual violence. There have been any number of photographs out there of Palestinians being held almost naked in public, very degrading poses, filmed like that. The films and videos put online not by independent journalists but by the Israeli military themselves. I know that zip tie handcuffs have become the rage. These plastic handcuffs. The Israelis have just been going through their supplies of them, getting resupplied by the United States and so on, just in something like that. It's important. The statement by Ms. Edwards, very important, because she said there's an absence of accountability and transparency. This creates a permissive environment for further abusive and humiliating treatment of Palestinians. I think that presentation by the special rapporteur on torture itself is something that should be immediately sent over to the International Criminal Court, where Karim Khan KC, the lead prosecutor, has made an announcement. He said, finally, 7 months into this genocidal war, long after the International Court of Justice gave orders for the conflict to end, said there is plausible evidence of genocide. Long after this, the International Criminal Court's special prosecutor has said that they are contemplating framing warrants against Mr. Netanyahu and the leadership of Hamas. But no word really about the other high officials of the Israeli government. And that's a curiosity. Like, where is Isaac Herzog and others who have made statements of intent for genocide? They should be facing warrants as well, particularly the defense minister. It's curious that he is not in the list. It's only Mr. Netanyahu. Why is Hamas in the list? Seems like that's a political decision made by Karim Khan to balance out the issue and not to really be guided by international law. It's a sort of balancing act. And frankly speaking, even though I object very much to the kind of false equivalence made there, it is interesting that a warrant for Mr. Netanyahu is going to be in process. That is very interesting. The United States responded saying that is outrageous. I'm interested to see what is the outcome of this. It's not germane to the leadership of Hamas that there be these warrants for them. I doubt that anybody will serve them the warrants, whether in Qatar or if they go to Damascus or wherever. But Mr. Netanyahu is going to face a problem. And strikingly, the government of Germany indicated that if the International Criminal Court does frame a warrant against Mr. Netanyahu, Germany will honor that warrant. That is really interesting, given Germany's hard-headed, nonsensical crackdown at any protest regarding the war in Gaza, any of it. They've been so hard-headed and ridiculous. Strikes me as pretty interesting that we have a situation now where Germany says, well, we will honor that warrant. You're with Give the People What They Want. We're brought to you by People's Dispatch. That's Zoe. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. We still miss Prashad. We're going to somehow weasel him back into the swing of things. I'm sure that's going to happen. Zoe, one of the reasons we're sort of, in and out of things is because we're always rushing to meetings and conferences. I know you're at the Palestine conference in Detroit. It's going to be a pretty interesting event. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, given the fact that the situation in Gaza is deteriorating by the day, even though we are, in almost month 8. What is this conference in Detroit on Palestine?
Yeah, well, around 3,000 people are going to be gathering here in Detroit, Michigan, to attend the People's Conference for Palestine. It's been convened by organizations that have been leading the struggle against Zionism and against U.S. imperialism across North America for the past 8 months. As we've covered on the show every single week, the protests in the U.S. keep breaking historic records. On November 4th, we had 500,000 people on the streets of Washington, D.C. January 13th, again, 400,000 people. Daily actions. And so this is sort of an attempt to channelize a lot of that energy and to plan for the struggle ahead. As you said, of course, the situation on the ground is deteriorating. Israel continues to be defiant to every single tenet of international law, every single body that tries to hold it accountable. Of course, as long as the United States refuses to do so and continues to send weapons, continues to give it the political and diplomatic backing on the world stage and in every single international forum, it feels like it can continue this campaign. And of course, it's carrying it out within U.S. interests as well, even if Joe Biden, Antony Blinken say otherwise and say that they're concerned about what's happening. Of course, we know that they could end this. So, this is an attempt to reckon with that reality, understand really what is going on, what is the political situation, both within the United States, the correlation of forces that makes it so. There have been these cracks. Biden has been forced to make these statements that we know are hollow, but they still constitute a shift and a departure from his previous policy on Palestine and a departure from its complete support of Israeli policy. So, continuing to strengthen this movement and also planning for the stage ahead, continuing to strengthen campaigns, bringing together more movements. We've seen, of course, historic participation of broad sectors of society that previously had not been involved in the struggle. Before, it used to be maybe the anti-imperialist groups, of course, the Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim groups. And now we've seen doctors, we've seen DJs, we've seen artists, we've seen all sectors of society come into the struggle because, of course, moved by the horrific images, by the horrifying reality of what genocide is, and also inspired by the resistance of the Palestinian people. And, of course, wanting to fight against their own government's complicity in what's happening. People are outraged that their tax dollars continue to fund this, and that despite being on the streets for 8 months, Joe Biden seems to just turn a blind eye to the demands of his citizens. Again, millions of people have been activated, have participated in different sorts of actions. This past week, we've seen Code Pink interrupting Antony Blinken's hearings on Capitol Hill, again, getting arrested day after day after day. calling these war criminals to account. And so it's this moment of coming together and shaping the path forward. I know you're going to be speaking on Sunday. That will be a very interesting conversation. There's speakers coming from across the movement in North America, from Palestine. And it'll be a very interesting weekend. We're going to be covering it, of course, at People's Dispatch, so you can tune in. We'll have video reports, we'll have text reports, so you can catch up on everything there. And it'll be a very interesting time.
There's a world on fire, and as I've been saying earlier, the Israelis have, right now dropped enough ordnance on Gaza to be equivalent to 9 nuclear bombs of the Hiroshima variety. So 9 nuclear bombs dropped on Gaza already. Well, the French who colonized French Polynesia, what's known as French Polynesia in the Pacific, in the 19th century, it was quote unquote discovered by James Cook in 1774. But when they colonized in the 19th century, colonized the Lapita people of a certain part, which is now New Caledonia, they tested nuclear weapons in that area. The French, in fact, conducted 196 nuclear tests in French Polynesia, treating that area really as flotsam, the other end of the world, despite novels and anthropologists talking about the paradise and so on. Paradise was treated with radioactivity. That's how the French behaved. It was quite terrible. Well, the fight back after World War II was considerable among the people of New Caledonia. The Kanak independence movement, which starts shortly after 1946, when France declared New Caledonia to be an overseas territory, a key archipelago in French Polynesia. New Caledonia is not an island. It's an archipelago. Grande Terre is the largest island of the lot, and so on. This struggle, this kind of independence movement, took off really after 1976 till 1988. This period is known as Les Événements, where there were large number of demonstrations led by the Kanak and Socialist National Liberation Front. This group was quite powerful and popular. They began to demand full elections for New Caledonia. They wanted to make sure that the franchise was basically not for French settlers, but for the Kanak people of New Caledonia. That was really the essence of that struggle at that time. It's a historical struggle. Well, the socialist government, Mitterrand's government and others, negotiated with them. They came up with an agreement in the late 1980s. The agreement set in terms some sort of transition period, from French overseas rule to some kind of dominion status or independence. It was very unclear in the late 80s what exactly the deal was, but certainly they were going to move forward. There were then, near the 20-year mark, a series of referenda were held. Large number of people voted, but the majority voted to stay in France. Partly there's an advantage to that. The advantage being, of course, that France, knowing that they may lose New Caledonia, started to pick up on welfare payments and so on. And during the COVID, that was the last of the referenda. I think the French also miscalculated. As a consequence of anxiety and fear, the vast majority of people voted to stay in France. And that was the miscalculation, because then comes the government of Emmanuel Macron, who's made legions of miscalculations when it's come to the so-called overseas territories of former French colonies, particularly in Africa and the Sahel region, in Algeria, Tunisia, and so on. Macron has really miscalculated in many of them. In this case, they proposed an electoral reform where they said that any French person who has lived in New Caledonia for 10 years can vote. Now, this, however democratic that might be, and you can have differences of opinion on whether that is actually a democratic maneuver, because after all people in a jurisdiction should be allowed to vote one way or the other. But this really put up the goat against the independence movement, which was very angry when told that the settlers would now have equivalent franchise to the Kanak, Lapita peoples and others. And so it's just a wave of protests began, burning of roads, barricades, and so on. Emmanuel Macron had to fly hurriedly to Grand Terre, had to make a statement saying, look, we're going to pause this, see what happens. It's a reminder of what's going on in the Pacific, the militarization, the new Cold War with China, United States aggressively trying to make sure that countries don't break away from global north control. This is what happened in the Solomon Islands just a few months ago, and bam, it's there in New Caledonia. Well, we'll see what happens. This is an unfinished story. Right now the French have said pause, but pause is not stop, and it's not arrête, it's pause, and we'll see where this goes. But it's an interesting moment. It shows that even in small countries, and New Caledonia is not a very large population, the desire both for some sort of independence, but really for dignity, is really high. Like, they don't want to have their feelings trampled, and I agree quite with the people who are angered by this. Well, one little bit of good news to round us up. This news comes about Julian Assange, who gave us so much news because he got from Chelsea Manning the great trove of US State Department materials. What's happened in the Assange case, Zoe?
Well, it has been about just over 5 years since Julian Assange was arrested from the Ecuadorian embassy and put in Belmarsh prison. It has been a long road for him as he awaits the UK court's deliberations on his extradition to the United States, where he will face 17 counts under the Espionage Act. And the UK court ruled this week to grant him an opportunity to appeal this extradition. It's been a back and forth in his case. He was initially, there was a ruling against his extradition because of the guarantees that would not be provided in the United States, where his health, the court ruled that his health would be under risk, his mental health. If he were extradited to the United States, then quickly U.S. prosecutors mobilized to show that actually, no, of course, the U.S. prison system has great conditions and his health will not be at risk. And so it's been a back and forth over the past couple of years. Of course, the family of Julian Assange and his supporters rallying, mobilizing, very anxious about this decision because, again, if Julian Assange is extradited to the United States, where because he published documents leaked by Chelsea Manning, he would face 17 counts under the Espionage Act. These charges he could be sentenced to a 175-year jail sentence. This is, of course, the entirety of the rest of his life. Extremely heavy punishment, again, for just the act of being a publisher, of sharing information about war crimes, about state secrets, about the reality of what happened on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan, of what the U.S. military was doing there, attacks on civilians. We've gone over it many, many times. And so I think there has been so much pressure put against the United Kingdom because, again, they don't, as has been proven in all of the different court proceedings, there is no extradition agreement between the US and the UK on political charges. And Julian Assange's defense has sought to argue on many different occasions that essentially this is a political case, and therefore the extradition of Julian Assange to the United States on political charges would be a violation of this extradition treaty. The courts have had different opinions on what they're going to consider, what they consider, grounds to actually make this ruling on the appeal, et cetera. But I think that they have been feeling the heat and they don't want to be responsible for I think they're going back and forth. Do they want to be responsible in the prosecution of really a journalist for publishing state secrets? We know that in Julian Assange's home country of Australia, the Prime Minister, many members of Parliament have been demanding that he be sent home to Australia where he can live with his family. There has been enormous amount of international pressure. Of course, who could really make this all stop is Joe Biden. He could withdraw the charges. There would be no extradition trial. There would be no sort of back and forth on this. However, the U.S. prosecution has refused to budge. And so really, this decision lies in the UK courts on whether or not they will appease the U.S. demands for his extradition. So again, this back and forth continues. Now, Julian Assange's defense has a possibility to appeal his extradition. We'll see what happens. But this just means more months of Julian Assange locked in Belmarsh prison. As I said, it's been over 5 years. His health has massively deteriorated, both physical and mental. And again, all of this for publishing things like collateral murder, things like the true civilian death toll of the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's an absolute outrage, and one hopes that Assange, a journalist, a publisher, sees the light of day, meets his two young children, and runs through the fields together, smelling the flowers with Stella Assange. We hope for him and his family that that is their immediate future. You're with Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch. Today, that's Zoe. Hopefully, we'll bring Prashad back in. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. We'll see you next week. It'll be 170th